The courtroom was deafeningly silent, the kind of silence that tastes like ozone before a lightning strike. Kendra Bowmont Sterling, a woman whose grace was often mistaken for weakness, stood before the bench, her hands cuffed, her eyes tracing the mahogany grain of the defense table. She wasn't supposed to be the one in shackles. Not today. But when Officer Trent Briggs, a man who treated his badge like a license for cruelty, stepped forward and delivered a stinging slap that echoed through the hallowed halls of justice, he didn't realize he had just signed his own professional death warrant. What Briggs didn't know was that the woman he had just assaulted wasn't a defendant. She was the storm, and in that moment, she would become the one holding the gavel. The air in the Cook County Courthouse was thick with the scent of floor wax and old paper. For Officer Trent Briggs, it was just another day of cleaning up the streets, a phrase he used to justify the heavy-handed tactics that had earned him 3 internal affairs investigations in as many years. He stood by the swinging doors of courtroom 4B, his thumbs tucked into his utility belt, radiating a misplaced sense of ownership over the building. Next to him stood his partner, Officer Nolan Reed. Reed was younger, leaner, and followed Briggs's lead with the desperate hunger of a man looking for a shortcut to a detective's gold shield. "Watch this one," Briggs muttered, nodding toward a woman sitting quietly in the third row. The woman was Kendra Bowmont. She was dressed in a sharp charcoal gray pantsuit, her hair pulled back into a professional bun. She held a leather-bound portfolio in her lap, her expression unreadable. To anyone else, she looked like a high-powered attorney or a visiting dignitary. To Briggs, she looked like trouble, the kind of person who asked too many questions during a routine stop. Earlier, Briggs had encountered her in the parking garage. He had tried to bully her out of a premium spot, claiming it was reserved for official business. Kendra hadn't budged. She had simply looked him in the eye, noted his badge number, and parked anyway. Briggs wasn't used to being ignored, and he certainly wasn't used to being outclassed. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was chaotic. The docket was full, and the air conditioning was struggling against the humid Chicago summer. The presiding judge for the session, Judge Harlan Voss, was notoriously late, a fact that usually annoyed the bailiffs, but today seemed to give the tension room to grow. Kendra rose from her seat to approach the clerk's desk, intending to hand over a set of documents. "Sit down, lady," Reed barked, stepping into her path. Kendra didn't stop. "I am submitting evidence for the upcoming hearing, officer. Please step aside." "I told you to sit," Briggs said, his voice dropping an octave, that dangerous edge appearing. He stepped forward, closing the distance until he was inches from her face. "This isn't a playground. You follow orders in my court." "It's not your court, Officer Briggs," Kendra replied calmly. "It's the people's court, and currently you're obstructing the process of law." The room went still. Lawyers paused their whispering. The court reporter's fingers froze over the steno machine. No one spoke to Briggs like that. Not in this building. Briggs felt the heat crawl up his neck. He saw the smirk on Reed's face and the expectant stares of the crowd. He felt small, and for a man like Briggs, feeling small was an existential threat. "You're under arrest for disorderly conduct and resisting an officer," Briggs snarled. He reached for his handcuffs, grabbing Kendra's wrist with enough force to leave a bruise. "On what grounds?" Kendra asked. Her voice remained steady, though her eyes flashed with a cold fire. "You have no probable cause, and you are violating my Fourth Amendment rights." "I'm the cause," Briggs hissed as he tried to jerk her arms behind her back. Kendra instinctively pivoted to maintain her balance. In the eyes of the onlookers, it was a graceful adjustment. In Briggs's mind, it was resisting. The sound was like a gunshot. Briggs swung his open palm, striking Kendra across the left cheek. The force of the blow snapped her head to the side, and her leather portfolio hit the floor, spilling papers across the carpet. A collective gasp ripped through the room. Reed took a half step back, his eyes widening. He knew, even he knew, that a line had been crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. Kendra stood perfectly still, A crimson mark began to bloom on her skin, but she didn't cry out. She didn't reach for her face. She slowly turned her head back to look at Briggs. The look in her eyes wasn't fear. It was something far more terrifying. It was a cold, clinical assessment of a man who had just destroyed his own life. "You shouldn't have done that," she whispered. "Get her in the chair," Briggs shouted, his voice cracking with a mix of adrenaline and the first seeds of panic. He shoved her toward the defendant's table, forcing her down. "Reed, get the zip ties. She's dangerous." At that exact moment, the side door leading to the judge's chambers swung open. The bailiff didn't announce, "All rise." He didn't have time. Kendra Bowmont didn't stay in the defendant's chair. As Briggs reached for her again, she dodged his grasp with a fluidity that suggested she had spent years in a dojo, not just an office. She didn't run for the exit. She ran for the bench. "Hey, get back here!" Briggs lunged, but he tripped over the very portfolio he had knocked out of her hands. Kendra vaulted the wooden partition, her movements precise and determined. She didn't stop at the clerk's desk. She climbed the steps to the high-backed leather chair, the seat of ultimate authority in the room. The courtroom held its breath. Briggs scrambled to his feet, his hand moving toward his holster. "Get down from there. That's a restricted area. I will use force." Kendra reached into the drawer of the bench, a drawer she clearly knew the contents of. She pulled out a black silken robe and threw it over her shoulders in one continuous motion. She didn't look like a defendant anymore. She looked like a goddess of vengeance. She picked up the heavy wooden gavel and brought it down once. Crack. The sound silenced Briggs mid-sentence. "Officer Briggs," Kendra said, her voice now amplified by the bench's microphone, echoing with the weight of absolute law. "Take your hand off your weapon before I have you charged with attempted assassination of a sitting superior court judge." The silence that followed was so heavy, it felt like it might collapse the ceiling. Briggs's hand froze on his belt. His face went from flushed red to a ghostly chalky white. "You," Briggs stammered. "Your Voss's replacement." "My name is Justice Kendra Bowmont Sterling," she said, leaning forward into the light. "And you are in my house now." The echoing crack of the gavel wasn't just a sound. It was a physical force that seemed to push the oxygen out of the room. Officer Trent Briggs stood paralyzed. His hand, the same hand that had just struck a woman in the face, was hovering near his sidearm, trembling with a sudden, violent realization. He looked at the woman on the bench. Justice Kendra Bowmont Sterling wasn't just a judge. She was the newly appointed administrative judge for the entire district, sent specifically to investigate reports of systemic misconduct within the courthouse security detail. "Officer Reed," Kendra said, her voice like a sharpened blade as she addressed Briggs's partner, "I suggest you take a very long, very careful look at your partner. Then, I suggest you decide exactly what kind of career you want to have in this city, because as of right now, Derek Briggs is no longer an officer of this court. He is a person of interest in a felony assault investigation." Reed looked like he wanted to vanish through the floorboards. He took 2 steps away from Briggs, his hands raised in a gesture of total surrender. "Justice Bowmont, I didn't know. I was just following his lead." "Following his lead into a civil rights violation," Kendra countered, her eyes never leaving Briggs. The red mark on her cheek was darker now, a vivid testament to the violence that had just occurred. "I believe there is a term for that in the legal world, Officer Reed. It's called being an accomplice." Briggs finally found his voice, though it sounded thin and desperate. "You trapped me. You were out there in civilian clothes, intentionally provoking us." "I was standing in a public hallway, Officer Briggs," she interrupted, her voice rising in authority. "I was observing the conduct of the men and women who are sworn to protect this building. I didn't have to provoke you. You saw a black woman you thought you could bully, and you couldn't help yourself. You didn't see a citizen. You saw a target." She turned to the court clerk, Penelope Lang, who was staring with her mouth slightly agape. "Penelope, call the sheriff's department. not the local precinct. I want the Internal Affairs Division and the state's attorney here immediately, and tell them to bring the handcuffs." "Wait, Your Honor," Briggs stammered, stepping toward the bench. "Let's just talk about this in chambers. I had a rough morning, the parking garage incident. You will address me as the court or Your Honor, and you will not take another step toward this bench," she commanded. The two primary bailiffs, who had been standing by the back doors in a state of shock, finally snapped into action. They were older men, Officer Ramirez and Officer Kane, who had worked in this building for 20 years. They moved toward Briggs with a grim efficiency. "Trent, don't make this worse," Ramirez said, his voice low. "Hand over your belt." Briggs looked around the room. The lawyers, many of whom he had joked with or intimidated in the past, were now looking at him with a mixture of pity and disgust. The gallery was filled with people he had pushed around, defendants waiting for their turn, families of the accused. For the first time in his life, the power dynamic had completely flipped. He was the one under the microscope. "This is a setup," Briggs hissed, though he slowly began to unbuckle his duty belt. "You can't just take the bench and start a trial. You're the victim. It's a conflict of interest." "I'm not starting a trial, Mr. Briggs," Kendra said, the mister hitting him harder than a physical blow. "I'm securing a crime scene. This courtroom is equipped with 4 high-definition cameras that record 24/7 for the safety of the judiciary. Every second of your assault, every word of your threats, and every ounce of your cowardice has been captured in 4K resolution." She leaned over the bench, her presence filling the cavernous room. "And as for the conflict of interest, I won't be the judge on your criminal case, but I am the judge in charge of this building, and I am summarily suspending your peace officer powers pending an emergency termination hearing. You are dismissed from my sight." As Ramirez and Kane led a dejected, beltless Briggs out of the side door toward the holding cells, the courtroom erupted into a low murmur of disbelief. Justice Kendra Bowmont Sterling didn't leave the bench. She didn't go to the back to put ice on her face. She sat there, the weight of the black robe on her shoulders, and looked at the next person on the docket. "Is the case of the state versus Thompson ready to proceed?" she asked, her voice steady. The defense attorney, a young man named Simon Fletcher, stood up, his legs shaking. "Yes, Your Honor." "Then let's begin," Kendra said. "We have a lot of work to do to restore the integrity of this room." News of the slap traveled faster than a wildfire. By midday, the local news vans were parked 3 deep outside the Cook County Courthouse. But inside, the atmosphere was even more tense. Justice Kendra Bowmont Sterling was not just any judge. She was the daughter of Judge Randall Beaumont, a legendary civil rights attorney who had spent his life fighting the very kind of old boys club that Trent Briggs represented. She had grown up in the shadow of the law, and she knew that if she blinked now, the system would find a way to protect its own. In a small conference room behind the bench, Kendra sat across from District Attorney Meredith Cross. Cross was a formidable woman with graying hair and a reputation for being tough on crime, but she looked visibly shaken by the video footage she had just reviewed. "Kendra, the video it's indefensible," Cross said, sliding a tablet back across the table. "Briggs is finished, but you know how the union works. They're going to argue that you baited him. They're going to look into your record, your family, everything." "Let them look," Kendra said, holding a cold compress to her cheek. "I stood in a hallway and asked an officer to move. If that constitutes baiting, then we might as well tear up the Constitution right now." "There's something else." Cross lowered her voice. "We did a preliminary dive into Briggs's files. This isn't the first time he's had an issue with a woman of color in this building. Sometime earlier, a court reporter named Lydia Norwood filed a complaint. She said Briggs cornered her in the elevator and threatened her when she recorded him using a racial slur in the hallway. The complaint was lost by the chief of security." Kendra's eyes narrowed. "Who was the chief of security then?" "Chief Victor Langford," Cross replied. The name hung in the air like a poisonous fog. Victor Langford wasn't just the former chief. He was the man Kendra had replaced, the man who had retired just weeks ago, under a cloud of health issues that many suspected were actually a cover for a corruption probe. So Briggs wasn't just a rogue officer, Kendra mused. He was a protected asset. He did the dirty work for the previous administration, and in exchange, his files stayed clean. Exactly, Cross said. And if we prosecute Briggs, he might start talking about who else knew what he was doing. There are people in this building who will do anything to keep him quiet. Just then, the door opened, and Officer Nolan Reed stepped in. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. "Your Honor, D.A. Cross," Reed stammered. "I need to talk, not as an officer, as a witness." Kendra looked at him. "Sit down, Officer Reed. I hope for your sake, you've brought something more than apologies." Reed sat, his hands gripped together so tightly his knuckles were white. "Briggs has a ledger," he whispered. "He kept it in his locker. He called it his insurance policy. It's a list of every favor he did for the judges and the DA's office over the last several years. Every lost piece of evidence, every intimidated witness, every favorable testimony." The room went silent. This wasn't just about an assault anymore. This was a bomb that could level the entire judicial district. "Where is it now?" Kendra asked, her voice a low, dangerous hum. "He told me to get it if things ever went south," Reed said. "He thinks I'm still on his side. He wants me to burn it." Kendra looked across at Cross, then back to Reed. "Officer Reed, you have one chance to save your soul. You're going to go to that locker. You're going to get that ledger, and you're going to bring it directly to me. And if you get caught," she added, "then you'll be the hero who helped me burn this rotten house to the ground. Or you'll be the man who goes down with Briggs. The choice is yours." The air in the basement of the Cook County Courthouse was stagnant, smelling of mildew and damp concrete. Officer Nolan Reed felt the sweat slicking his palms as he approached Locker 714. This was the belly of the beast, the locker room where Officer Trent Briggs had reigned as an unofficial king for years. Reed's hands shook as he dialed the combination Briggs had whispered to him through the bars of the holding cell. The metal latch clicked with a sound that felt as loud as a gunshot in the empty room. He pulled the door open. Inside was a standard array of police gear, a spare uniform, a half-empty bottle of bourbon, and a stack of fitness magazines. But tucked behind a false back in the locker, a modification Briggs had made himself, was a small black moleskin notebook. Reed reached for it, but a voice from the shadows stopped his heart. "You're a little late for cleaning duty, aren't you, Nolan?" Reed spun around. Standing by the weight bench was Sergeant Declan Mallister. Mallister was a veteran, a man with a chest full of commendations and eyes that had seen too much. He was also Briggs's oldest friend on the force. "Sarge," Reed stammered, tucking the notebook behind his back. Briggs asked me to grab his personal effects, since he's being processed." Mallister stepped into the light, a heavy mag light in his hand. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed. "Give me the book, kid. You don't know what's in there. You don't want to know. It's not just Briggs's neck on the line. It's the whole department." "He slapped a judge, Sarge," Reed said, his voice gaining a sudden, unexpected strength. "He assaulted a woman in open court. If we protect him now, we're exactly what everyone says we are." "It's not about protection anymore," Mallister hissed, taking a step closer. "It's about survival. Do you know whose names are in that ledger? Names of people who can make you disappear before you ever reach the witness stand. Give it to me." Reed looked at the exit, then at the heavy-set sergeant. He knew he couldn't outrun him, and he definitely couldn't outfight him, but he remembered the look in Justice Kendra Bowmont Sterling's eyes, the absolute certainty that the law mattered more than the men who wore the uniform. "No," Reed said. Before Mallister could react, the heavy steel door to the locker room swung open. Justice Kendra Bowmont Sterling stepped in, flanked by two armed state marshals. She wasn't wearing her robe now. She was in her charcoal suit, the bruise on her cheek, a dark, defiant badge of honor. "I believe the officer said no, Sergeant Mallister," Kendra said, her voice echoing off the metal lockers. Mallister froze. He looked at the marshals, then at the judge. He knew the game was up. He slowly lowered his flashlight. "You're making a mistake, Your Honor," Mallister warned. "You open that book, and you'll find out this building is held together by the very rot you're trying to cut out." "Then let it fall," Kendra replied. She walked up to read and took the notebook. She flipped it open right there in the dim light of the basement. Her eyes scanned the first few pages. Her expression, usually an impenetrable mask of judicial calm, flickered with a moment of genuine shock. "What is it?" Reed whispered. Kendra didn't answer immediately. She turned to a page near the middle. Her finger traced a name written in Briggs's cramped, ugly handwriting. "It's not just payoffs and suppressed evidence," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "It's a schedule of private meetings between Briggs and the former chief of security, Victor Langford, and the current public defender, Quentin Vale." The twist hit like a physical blow. Quentin Vale was the man currently representing the little guys in her courtroom, the man who was supposed to be the check against police overreach. If he was in Briggs's pocket, then every trial in the last several years was a sham. But there was one more name, one that made Kendra's blood run cold. At the very back of the book, under a section labeled "The Ultimate Insurance," was a series of bank account numbers and a name that shouldn't have been there: Randall Bowmont, her father, the man whose legacy she was trying to protect. Kendra sat in her darkened chambers, the black notebook lying on her desk like a coiled snake. The revelation about her father felt like a hollow-point bullet to the chest. Randall Bowmont, the lion of the law, had been receiving monthly consulting fees from a shell company linked to the police union's slush fund, the same fund Briggs used to pay for his silence. A knock at the door startled her. It was D.A. Meredith Cross. "The state's attorney is ready to file the felony assault charges against Briggs," Cross said, walking in. She noticed Kendra's pale face. "Kendra, what's wrong? Did you find something in the ledger?" Kendra had a choice. She could hide the page. She could tear it out and preserve her father's memory, ensuring her own rise to power stayed untainted. Or she could do what her father had always told her to do, even if he hadn't done it himself: seek the truth, no matter where it led. She pushed the notebook toward Cross. "Look at the last page." Cross read it. She slumped into a chair, the air leaving her lungs in a long, pained whistle. "Oh, Kendra, I'm so sorry. If this goes public, your father's entire career will be dismantled. Every case he ever won, every precedent he set, it'll all be questioned." "And if I hide it," Kendra said, her voice cracking, "then I'm no better than Briggs. I'd be using my power to protect my own, just like he did." "But Briggs slapped you," Cross argued. "He's a monster. Your father was a hero who maybe made a mistake in his later years." "A mistake that cost people their freedom, Meredith," Kendra snapped. "Look at the dates. These payments happened during the East Side arson trials. My father was the presiding judge. He gave the maximum sentence to 3 young men despite the evidence being shaky. And look who the arresting officer was." Cross looked down. Derek Briggs. The puzzle was complete. Briggs had provided the evidence to help Randall Bowmont win a high-profile case that secured his legacy. And in exchange, Bowmont had looked the other way, while Briggs turned the courthouse into his personal fiefdom. "I have to recuse myself from the Briggs case," Kendra whispered. "And I have to call a special prosecutor for my father's estate." "You'll lose everything," Cross warned. "The appointment, the respect of the bench. They'll say the Bowmont name is cursed." "The Bowmont name is already cursed," Kendra said, standing up and reaching for her gavel. "It's time to see if Kendra Sterling, my married name, the one I stopped using to honor him, can stand on her own." The plaza outside the Cook County Courthouse looked more like a battlefield than a place of civic process. Hundreds of protesters had gathered, their signs demanding an end to badge-covered brutality. Above them, the local news helicopters circled like vultures, their rhythmic thrum providing a heartbeat for the city's collective anxiety. Inside courtroom 4B, the very room where the slap had occurred, was packed so tightly that the bailiffs had to bar the doors minutes before the session began. This wasn't just a bail hearing for a rogue cop, it was a reckoning. The old guard of the Chicago legal system sat in the front rows, their faces pale and their whispers sharp. Men like District Attorney Preston Cole and Chief of Police Franklin Royce were there, not out of support for Officer Trent Briggs, but out of fear. They knew that if the rumors about the insurance ledger were true, the woman about to take the bench was holding a grenade with the pin already pulled. Trent Briggs sat at the defense table, looking remarkably composed. He had spent the last week in a private cell, courtesy of some old friends in the sheriff's department, and he still carried the air of a man who believed the world owed him a favor. He was dressed in a sharp navy suit, his hair slicked back, looking every bit the decorated veteran his defense team intended to portray. Next to him sat his attorney, Damon Pierce. Pierce was a man whose reputation was built on high-profile acquittals and a ruthless ability to find the dark spots in an opponent's history. He was currently whispering into Briggs's ear, a confident smirk playing on his lips. They thought they had the upper hand. They had spent the last 48 hours digging into the Bowmont family's financial records, and they believed they had found the leverage needed to force Justice Kendra Bowmont Sterling into a corner. At the appointed hour, the side door opened. The bailiff, Officer David Kane, stood taller than he had in years. "All rise," he bellowed, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "The Superior Court of Cook County is now in session. The Honorable Justice Kendra Bowmont Sterling presiding." A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. The name change was the first shot fired. By dropping Bowmont, the name of her legendary father, and using Sterling, her married name, which she had previously kept out of the public eye, Kendra was signaling a total break from the past. She walked to the bench with a chilling, rhythmic grace. She wasn't wearing her father's robe, the one with the silk lining and the gold-stitched initials. She was wearing a new one, a deep matte black that seemed to absorb the light around her. Her face was a mask of granite, the bruise on her cheek, now a faint yellowish mark, that served as a silent testimony to the violence that had brought them all here. "Please be seated," Kendra said. The microphone picked up the low, resonant timbre of her voice, projecting it to the very back of the room. She didn't look at the cameras. She didn't look at the press. She looked directly at Trent Briggs. "We are here today for a preliminary hearing and the setting of bail in the matter of the state versus Trent Briggs. Before we hear arguments from counsel, the court has several administrative matters to address regarding evidence recently recovered and entered into the record." Damon Pierce stood up, his hand raised. "Your Honor, if I may, given the highly personal nature of the allegations and the history between you and my client, the defense moves for your immediate recusal. We believe there is a significant conflict of interest that prevents this court from being impartial." Kendra didn't blink. "Motion noted, Mr. Pierce. However, your motion is based on the premise that this is a simple assault case. It is not. This court is currently acting in its administrative capacity to address systemic corruption identified within this building. Your motion is denied." "Your Honor," Pierce started, his voice rising. "Sit down, Mr. Pierce," Kendra commanded. The coldness in her tone was enough to make the veteran lawyer drop back into his chair as if he'd been shoved. Kendra reached for a thick, clear evidence bag containing the black moleskin notebook. She held it up for the entire room to see. "This ledger," she said, "was recovered from the defendant's locker. It contains meticulously detailed entries of payments, favors, and suppressed evidence dating back several years. It is a map of a criminal enterprise operating under the color of law." The courtroom went silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the carpeted floor. Among the entries, Kendra continued, her voice never wavering despite the explosive nature of what she was about to say, are records of monthly payments made to several key figures in this district. This includes the former chief of security, the current public defender's office, and most tragically, the late Judge Randall Beaumont. A roar of whispers erupted in the gallery. Protesters outside could be heard cheering as the news leaked through social media updates. Kendra slammed her gavel down once. Crack. "Silence in this court," she roared. She turned her gaze back to Briggs. "Mr. Briggs, you kept this book as insurance. You thought that if you ever got into trouble, you could use the names within it to buy your way out. You thought that by showing me my father's name in these pages, I would crumble, that I would protect his memory at the expense of my oath." Briggs leaned back, a dark, ugly smile spreading across his face. He leaned toward his microphone. "It's a lot to lose, isn't it, Kendra? A whole family legacy. All that respect. Gone in a second." "My father's legacy died the moment he took your money, Mr. Briggs," Kendra replied, her voice filled with a profound, quiet strength. "I am not here to protect a ghost. I am here to serve the living, and the living require the truth." She turned to the back of the room. "Bailiffs, please escort Attorney Damon Pierce from the defense table." Pierce stood up, his face turning a shade of purple. "On what grounds? You can't remove defense counsel in the middle of a hearing." "The grounds of being an unindicted co-conspirator, Mr. Pierce," Kendra said, sliding a sheet of paper across the bench to the clerk. "According to the ledger, you were the primary intermediary for the payoffs to the public defender's office during the East Side arson trials. You didn't just defend criminals, you helped create them. Officer Kane, take him into custody." The room descended into chaos. Pierce tried to scramble toward the exit, but the bailiffs were faster. They tackled him near the swinging doors. The sound of handcuffs clicking shut echoed through the room. Briggs watched his lawyer being dragged away, and for the first time, the arrogance on his face began to crack. "Now, Mr. Briggs," Kendra said, leaning over the bench, "regarding your bail, the state's attorney has presented evidence of your assault on my person, which was captured on high-definition video. But more importantly, the Federal Bureau of Investigation has now assumed jurisdiction over the racketeering charges stemming from this ledger." She paused, letting the weight of the FBI mention sink in. "You are a flight risk. You are a danger to the community, and you are a primary witness in a federal investigation that will likely dismantle the leadership of this precinct. You have shown a total disregard for the law you were sworn to uphold." Briggs stood up, his hands balled into fists. "You think you're so clean? You think you're better than me because you've got a robe? You're a Beaumont. You were raised on the money I earned. And I will spend the rest of my life paying back that debt to the people you hurt." Kendra shot back. "Bail is denied. You will be remanded to the custody of the federal marshals. And Mr. Briggs, in the federal system, there are no friends in the sheriff's department to give you a private cell." As the marshals stepped forward to take Briggs, he lunged across the table. He wasn't trying to escape. He was trying to reach her, his face contorted with a primal, animalistic rage. "I'll kill you. You hear me? You're dead, Sterling. You're dead." He didn't get within 5 feet of the bench. Officer Nolan Reed, the man who had been Briggs's partner for years, stepped in front of him. Reed didn't use his nightstick. He didn't use his taser. He simply grabbed Briggs by the collar and forced him to the ground with a strength born of years of suppressed guilt. "Enough, Trent," Reed hissed into his ear. "It's over. Just stop." As Briggs was led out in heavy chains, his boots dragging on the floor, Kendra Bowmont Sterling sat back in her chair. She watched him go, her expression unreadable. The hard karma had arrived, but it had brought a heavy price. She had just publicly dismantled her own father's name and sent half of the courthouse leadership to prison. She looked out at the gallery. The old guard were already scurrying for the exits, their phones out, trying to call lawyers of their own. The room was emptying. But for the first time in her life, Kendra felt like the space was truly hers. She picked up the gavel. This court is in recess. The sound of the final strike was soft, but it felt like the closing of a door on a century of corruption. The air inside the Cook County Courthouse had changed. For decades, it had been a place of heavy shadows and whispered deals, where the scent of stale coffee and old secrets clung to the marble pillars. But months after the day, Justice Kendra Bowmont Sterling had taken the bench in a whirlwind of fire and truth. The building felt lighter. The old guard had been dismantled, not by a single blow, but by the relentless grinding gears of a system finally forced to work as intended. But for Trent Briggs, the atmosphere was anything but light. The sentencing hearing for the man who was once the most feared officer in the district was not held in the grand wood-paneled splendor of the main courtroom. Instead, it was held in the cold, utilitarian space of Courtroom 1A, a basement room usually reserved for preliminary hearings. It was a subtle final insult to a man who had once treated the entire building as his personal kingdom. Briggs sat at the defense table, but he was unrecognizable. The tailored suit and the polished duty belt were gone, replaced by a drab, ill-fitting orange jumpsuit that seemed to hang off his shrinking frame. He had lost weight. His skin had taken on a shallow grayish hue from months of being held in administrative segregation. The arrogance that had once defined his every movement had been replaced by a twitching, nervous energy. He looked like a cornered animal that had finally realized the cage wasn't going to open. Next to him sat his new attorney, Garrett Holt. Holt was a man who specialized in lost causes, but even he looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. He kept his distance from Briggs, his body language screaming a desire to disassociate from the man who had become the face of police corruption in the state. At the prosecution table, D.A. Meredith Cross sat with a mountain of folders. These weren't just the files for the assault on Justice Sterling. These were the ghosts of Briggs's past, finally invited into the light. "All rise," the bailiff intoned, though the voice lacked the fear it once held when Briggs walked the halls. Justice Kendra Bowmont Sterling entered. She walked with a measured, deliberate pace. She no longer wore the mark of the slap on her cheek. The physical bruise had faded long ago, but the memory of it lived in the steel of her gaze. She was no longer just the daughter of a legend. She was a woman who had burned her own legacy to the ground to build something honest on the ashes. "Please, be seated," Kendra said. Her voice was calm, but it held the weight of a mountain. "We are here for the final sentencing in the matter of the People versus Trent Briggs." The gallery was a sea of faces that Briggs had tried to forget. There was Lydia Norwood, the court reporter, whose career he had tried to destroy when she witnessed him taking a bribe. There was Mrs. Beatrice Ramsey, the widow of a man who had died in the back of Briggs's squad car under mysterious circumstances that had been swept under the rug by the former administration. There was even Nolan Reed, the former partner who had turned state's evidence, looking both relieved and haunted. Meredith Cross stood to deliver the state's impact statement. She didn't lead with the slap. She led with the insurance ledger. "Your Honor," Cross began, her voice echoing in the small room. The defendant, Trent Briggs, didn't just assault a sitting judge. He assaulted the very idea of justice. For years, he operated a shadow government within these walls. We have identified no fewer than 48 cases where evidence was lost, witnesses were intimidated, or testimony was fabricated at the behest of Mr. Briggs and his associates. She paused, looking directly at Briggs, who refused to meet her eyes. "The karma of a lifetime of cruelty has finally come due. We are not just asking for the maximum sentence for the assault. We are asking for consecutive sentencing for the racketeering, the perjury, and the civil rights violations discovered in the wake of his arrest. The state recommends a total of 35 years. A sharp intake of breath hissed through the room. 35 years. For a man Briggs's age, It was a life sentence. Garrett Holt rose to offer a half-hearted plea for leniency, citing Briggs's years of service and the stress of the job. But it was a hollow argument, and everyone knew it. When he sat down, the room fell into a silence so profound you could hear the hum of the overhead fluorescent lights. Kendra leaned forward, her elbows on the bench, her fingers interlaced. She looked at Briggs for a long time, not with anger, but with a profound, chilling pity. "Mr. Briggs," she said softly, "do you have anything you wish to say before I pronounce judgment?" Briggs stood up slowly. His legs were shaking. For a moment, it looked like he might explode in another fit of rage, but the fire was gone. He was just a small, broken man in an orange suit. "I did what I had to do," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I kept order. This city, it's a jungle. You don't know what it's like out there. You sit up here in your robes and judge people who have to get their hands dirty." "I have seen the dirt, Mr. Briggs," Kendra replied, her voice cold. "I have seen it on the hands of the man I called my father. I have seen it in the eyes of the victims you thought were too small to matter. You didn't keep order. You kept a hostage. You held this entire district hostage to your ego and your greed." She picked up the sentencing report. "The law is a mirror, Mr. Briggs. For a long time, you thought you could break that mirror and never have to look at what you'd become. But the mirror is still here. And today, it reflects exactly what you are." She began to read the sentence. "For the felony assault of a public official, 10 years. For the counts of racketeering and conspiracy, 20 years, to be served consecutively. For the 3 counts of perjury that led to the wrongful imprisonment of innocent citizens, 5 years. A total of 35 years in the state penitentiary, with no possibility of parole for the first 25. Crack. The sound of the gavel felt like the closing of a tomb. Briggs didn't scream. He didn't fight. He simply collapsed back into his chair as the bailiffs moved in to shackle his ankles. The hard karma wasn't just the prison time. It was the total, absolute erasure of his power. He was being taken to a place where his badge meant nothing, where the men he had spent a career brutalizing would be waiting for him. As Briggs was led away, the courtroom cleared quickly. People wanted to get away from the stench of the past, but Kendra didn't leave. She walked back to her chambers, the same chambers that had once belonged to her father, Randall Bowmont. The room was nearly empty now. The heavy oak desk had been cleared of his pictures and his awards. The only thing that remained was the small black moleskin ledger, now a piece of evidence labeled in a plastic bag. There was a knock on the door. It was Detective Lena Brooks, a woman who had been instrumental in cleaning up the precinct after the scandal broke. "We finished the audit of the East Side arson cases, Your Honor," Brooks said, placing a new file on the desk. "You were right. The evidence against those 3 boys was planted by Briggs. And your father, he knew. There's a memo in his private files. He knew the evidence was tainted, but he needed the conviction to secure his seat on the Supreme Court." Kendra closed her eyes. The pain of it was still sharp, a dull ache in her chest that she knew might never truly go away. "And the boys, they've been exonerated," Brooks said with a small smile. "They walked out of Joliet this morning. They're asking to meet you, to thank you." "Tell them I'm the one who should be apologizing," Kendra said. "You didn't do this, Kendra," Brooks said firmly. "You're the one who stopped it. That's what people are going to remember. Not the Beaumont who hid the truth, but the Sterling who told it." After Brooks left, Kendra stood by the window, looking out over the city. She thought about the slap. She thought about that split second of violence in the hallway that had set this entire chain of events in motion. If Briggs hadn't been so arrogant, if he hadn't thought he could strike a black woman with impunity, he might still be out there. He might still be destroying lives. His own cruelty had been his undoing. It was the ultimate irony. The very thing he used to maintain his power was the thing that had stripped it away. Derek Briggs arrived at the Menard Correctional Center. The transition from the king of the courthouse to inmate number 88392 was a brutal one. The intake process was designed to strip away the last remnants of a man's dignity. And for Briggs, it was a descent into a living nightmare. He was stripped, searched, and deloused by guards who knew exactly who he was and who had no intention of making his stay comfortable. "Hey, Briggs," one of the guards whispered as he tossed a thin, scratchy blanket into the cell. "I heard you like to slap women. Let's see how that works out for you in the yard." The cell was 6 by 9 feet. The walls were scarred with the names of the men who had come before him. Briggs sat on the thin mattress, the cold of the concrete floor seeping into his bones. In the cell next to him, a voice drifted through the bars. "Is that you, Trent?" Briggs froze. He knew that voice. It was Vincent Kane, a man Briggs had framed for a drug hit years ago because Kane wouldn't pay the protection fee Briggs demanded. "I've been waiting for you, Trent," Kane said, his voice low and terrifyingly calm. "I heard you were coming. We all heard. The word got here faster than the bus." Briggs pressed his back against the wall, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. This was the true face of the karma he had cultivated. It wasn't just the loss of his job or his reputation. It was the fact that he was now trapped in a world he had populated with enemies. He had spent years building a hell, and now he had to live in it. He looked at the small barred window at the top of the cell. He could see a sliver of the moon. He thought about courtroom 4B. He thought about the woman who had stood before him, the woman he had thought was nobody. He realized then that he hadn't just slapped a woman. He had slapped the hand of fate itself, and fate had slapped back with the weight of 1,000 souls. Back at the courthouse, a new plaque was being installed near the entrance of the parking garage. It wasn't a monument to a judge or a politician. It was a simple bronze tablet that read, "In this place, the law applies to all. No one is above it and no one is below it. Let truth be the only authority." Justice Kendra Bowmont Sterling stood by as the workers finished the installation. She was surrounded by a new generation of officers, men and women like Nolan Reed, who had been given a second chance to do the job right, and Detective Lena Brooks, who finally had the resources to investigate without fear. The courthouse was no longer a place of shadows. It was a place of light. As Kendra walked back toward the entrance, she saw a young woman standing by the pillars, looking up at the building with a look of hesitation. She was wearing a simple suit, carrying a folder, her eyes wide with the intimidation that many felt when facing the legal system. Kendra stopped. She didn't wait for the woman to approach her. She walked over and offered a hand. "Are you here for a hearing?" Kendra asked, her voice warm and steady. "Yes," the girl whispered. I'm a bit nervous. I've heard stories about this place." Kendra smiled, a genuine, hopeful smile that reached her eyes. "The stories are changing," she said. "Come on, I'll show you the way. My name is Kendra, and in this building, you are safe." The two women walked into the courthouse together, their footsteps echoing on the clean, polished marble. The past was buried. The debts were paid. And for the first time in a generation, justice wasn't just a word carved into stone. It was a promise kept. The hard karma had hit. The twists had settled. And the real-life story of the woman who took the seat was just beginning. Justice isn't always fast, and it isn't always pretty. But as Trent Briggs found out, it is inevitable. This story serves as a powerful reminder that no badge is a shield against the truth, and no gavel is too heavy for a hand that seeks the right path. Kendra Bowmont Sterling lost her father's myth, but gained a legacy of her own, one built on integrity rather than intimidation. If you believe that no one is above the law, and you enjoyed seeing the tables turn in that courtroom, then hit that like button right now. Share this story with someone who needs to see that karma always finds its way home. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another tale of justice served cold. What would you have done in Kendra's shoes? Let us know in the comments below.